Hello, and welcome to this ARA webinar with staff from CPDA, the Council of Producers and Distributors of Agrotechnology, titled Adjuvant Advantage for the Sales Agronomist. This is the third webinar in Season 3 of this series. Today's webinar will focus on adjuvants and herbicides and how to optimize performance while minimizing crop response. We would like to take this time to thank Drexel Chemical Company and Helena Agri Enterprises for sponsoring today's webinar. My name is Hunter Carpenter, Senior Director of Public Policy for ARA, and I'll introduce our webinar speakers in just a bit. But first, I'll go over a few housekeeping items so you know what to expect. Webinars are an important part of the ARA professional development pathway and provide a great opportunity for ARA member companies to help educate their employees. Today's webinar will be recorded and added to the member-only ARA dashboard section of our website. As a reminder, you can log into the ARA member-only dashboard to access past webinar recordings at any time. If you do not have an ARA login, you can email info@aradc.org to set one up. Questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation, but you can type them into the chat panel at any time. So with that out of the way, I'm excited to introduce our guest speakers, Johnny Roberts and Greg Dahl. Johnny has over 45 years of experience in the development and technical support of pesticide, fertilizer, and adjuvant formulation. 44 of those years were spent with Helena Agri Enterprises. And Johnny is also the co-inventor of 15 U.S. patents related to pesticide, adjuvant, and nutritional formulations. Greg retired from Winfield United in December 2023, following over 40 years working for both the private and public sectors. He is currently serving as president of the Weed Science Society of America and was president of the North Central Weed Science Society in 2017. He has been a certified crop advisor since 1998, and over 70 products have been brought to market from research by Greg and his team. Much of this research involves adjuvants and application technology. We would also like to acknowledge CPDA's advisory working group for all of their input in helping make this such a successful series of webinars for both ARA and CPDA. Following today's presentation, a QR code will be displayed for you to scan from your mobile device and earn one IPM continuing education credit as approved for certified crop advisors. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Johnny for our presentation.
Thank you, Hunter. And I thought we'd start first with sort of an update on the Endangered Species Act, and in particular, how adjuvants are going to have a role in helping us to comply with that act. Essentially, the Endangered Species Act, or ESA, is a situation where the EPA has been charged with coming up with strategies to mitigate the potential harm to endangered species or threatened ones as well. Next slide, please. And the way they'll be implementing these strategies is that once they identify them, they will be added to the pesticide label. This will be a slow process. We only expect a few labels to be changing this year, and there'll be more as the years move forward. Next slide, please. So what's going to change? What's the timeline on these changes? Well, the strategies for mitigating the risk from herbicides and rodenticides have already been finalized, and they were taken care of in 24. We expect insecticides to be this year, and then fungicides the next. Next slide, please. So this is a national situation, and it has implication for all of our areas. There is not a single county, state in the U.S. that does not have some endangered or threatened species. So all of these issues will have to be addressed, and so it's a big change that's coming. Next slide, please. So where are we today? Fortunately, with the support of grower organizations and the USDA, we've been able to make drift reduction adjuvants, or DRAs, as part of this herbicide strategy. And we expect it to be a template for going forward with both the insecticides and fungicides as well. Next slide. And to give you some idea of the impact of this, one of the big strategies will be, of course, no pesticide application spray buffers. And these buffers could vary in size. Some of them can be quite large. And fortunately, we can demonstrate through data that we can mitigate the potential for driftable fines dramatically and thus reduce the applicable spray buffer zone. In this particular case, we can reduce that buffer zone by 80 to 95% when used with the appropriate nozzle and other mitigation methods. Next slide, please. Here is an example of what such a reduction will look like. This is a recent label for a BSF glufosinate product. If you look at the ground boom spray application buffer, what's required under the strategy is 10 foot. However, with the inclusion of a drift reduction adjuvant, we can reduce that essentially to zero. So this is will be a great and useful tool. Without some mitigation tools like this, we could look at a lot of arable land coming out of production. So this is a great project to move forward with, and we expect some more progress along the way. Next slide, please. So in terms of agenda, getting back to our adjuvants or herbicide, this is what we'll be discussing today. We're going to look at some of the variables that impact herbicide efficacy and application. How can they be used to minimize it? What do the herbicide labels say about adjuvants today? And then what guidance do we use when the label isn't clear or doesn't present anything in terms of direction? Talk a little bit about herbicide crop safety as it relates to the inclusion of adjuvants, and then on to spray mix and equipment compatibility. Next slide. So fortunately, we have a lot of great resources out there we can access. Here are three in particular that I think you'll find quite useful. The Purdue Extension 107 publication and 86 are excellent overviews. I'll be leveraging off of some of what they talk about in these particular publications. Another one is the Australian Grain Research and Development Corporation, who has another good general discussion on the topic. Next slide, please. Also, there's starting to be some really wonderful web resources from various universities. These are the ones that in particular that you'll find good reviews on, good research overviews, and encourage you to follow up and check with these locations when you have any further questions about them after our seminar today. Next slide. So to get to the meat of it, why we even have to deal with spray adjuvants, it all goes back to the fact that water is an extremely poor carrier and has negative impacts on both application and efficacy. It has poor coverage characteristics. There's a tendency for water to bounce off. It evaporates. It washes off. And there are water quality issues as well. So all of these things together make water a challenge as in terms of being a pesticide carrier. Next slide, please. So we typically break adjuvants into two big groups: the enhancers, things that have a direct impact on the overall activity of a pesticide application, things like the nonylate surfactants, the crop oil concentrates, methylated seed oils, and then another category which we call utilities, which are more directed at the application side of it. Compatibility, foam reduction, drift reduction. While they may not have a direct impact on pesticide efficacy, they certainly have an indirect one in terms of making a good, thorough application that doesn't have issues like we just outlined. Next slide, please. So overall, if you look at the adjuvant business, they're growing dramatically. There's nothing magical about 1976. That's when I started my career. And in that particular year, there were only 3 herbicide labels that even recommended a spray adjuvant. Contrast that with today, there are more than 1,000 that either suggest or require one. So there's a big change. There's a lot of reasons behind that change. So we're seeing a market that continues to grow, and more applications are found each day that goes by. Next slide, please. And you're starting to see some really detailed directions on specific pesticide labels about the use of adjuvants. I'm using this example here of the Bayer product Harness Max. Very specific recommendations in terms of use, adjuvant type, warnings about crop safety, etc. So very thorough directions on when and how to use adjuvants. Next slide. You're seeing, like in the case of Safend from BSF, not only are they telling you the type of adjuvant you use, in this case MSO, they're even specifying the percentage that the MSO should be in the specific adjuvant product. Then the other movement we've all seen in recent years with the over-the-top dicamba applications. We're seeing approval lists, things of that nature on adjuvants, requirements on which ones to use and how to use them. So there is a movement going forward of more established pesticide labels when it comes to adjuvant recommendations. Next slide. But unfortunately, we still deal with a lot of confusion. This comes from the fact that adjuvants are essentially unregulated outside of 2 states. Many of the herbicide labels are not specific. They confuse oftentimes confusion between adjuvant and surfactant. There's confusion between crop oil and crop oil concentrate. There's confusion when you use a surfactant or an oil. Sometimes people interchangeably use seed oils with MSO. There's a lot of still use of non-standardized definitions and just a general lack of knowledge and training. Next slide, please. And another thing that is somewhat maddening to people is that on some of these labels you may not have a direct recommendation for an adjuvant, but you'll see all kinds of language that implies that you use them. Things like thorough coverage is important, avoiding off-target drift, directions on how spray mixes must be uniform and the coverage must be maximized. These are all indirect recommendations to use spray adjuvants. And then, of course, when it comes down to better deposition, how could you not require or desire that? So all pesticide applications, not just herbicides, benefit from better deposition. Next slide. So how do we optimize adjuvant use when clear label recommendations are lacking? Well, the first immediate thing we need to do is to confirm that the adjuvant functional claims utilize standard non-commercial ASTM definitions. Sometimes this can be a challenge. The easiest way to do that is to simply rely on CPDA certified adjuvants, as under their current direction, they can only use ASM standardized claims. And then oftentimes there will be a long commercial experience and replicated field trials that support the use. But at the end of the day, the best way to handle this particular challenge is just to improve our product knowledge and train our growers and applicators on how and when to use spray adjuvants. Next slide. So I'll be using a lot of generalizations going forward, and as Mark Twain reminded us, all generalizations are false, including this one, meaning that there's inevitably are some exceptions along the way, but the generalizations I'll be using today are pretty thorough, pretty applicable to most of what we're going to be dealing with. Next slide, please. So how do we use these adjuvants to maximize herbicide activity while minimizing the potential for crop injury and spray application issues? I'm going to focus on two groups, the non-ionic surfactants and the oil-based adjuvants, while Greg will be focusing on a water conditioning subject later. Next slide, please. So at the end of the day, basically what we're trying to do is to make water act like an oil. And by doing that, we can overcome some of the limitations. In fact, a lot of the limitations that water has. Next slide, please. Why do we want to make sprays more oil-like? Well, plant surfaces that we're targeting are very oil-loving. They tend to be lipophilic. It's the term we use. Your water-based spray, on the other hand, is lipophobic. So there is a repulsion between these two right off the bat. And then oftentimes we have active ingredients that are not lipophilic, meaning they're not oil-like, and they're very slow to be absorbed into plant tissue. Next slide, please. So surfactants make water behave more like oil by simply reducing surface tension, minimizing the spray droplet bounce, and they can actually increase the infiltration of some active ingredients into plant tissue. Next slide. So first consideration when matching up adjuvants with pesticides is to consider, is this a contact active ingredient mode of action or is it systemic? With contacts, you tend to find that they're more susceptible to being washed off. They tend to have your least oil solubility. They respond more to increased coverage. They tend to have more or needs for absorption enhancement, or less need, excuse me, for absorption enhancement. And they also tend to be more dependent on warm temperatures. On the other hand, on systemics, we can have a big negative impact from evaporation. This is something that Greg will be discussing as well, where if we lose water in these spray deposits, we tend to lose their ability to diffuse across plant tissue. The overall impact of plant surfaces can be a big factor. We tend to have a bigger need for just overall absorption enhancement. And then there's the impact of water quality issues as well. Next slide, please. So most of these herbicides, we can put them either into the contact or systemic category. I've listed the contacts on my left here, but you look under systemic, rather than individual herbicides, we're talking about whole families. So the majority of what we'll be dealing with in herbicides tend to be ones that are systemic to minimal absorption, not so much on contact. Next slide, please. So it's critical to keep in mind that spreading and wetting coverage, those are all important, but reducing spray deposit evaporation and increasing the degree of absorption and spread and the amount and the speed of it are just as important as spreading and wetting. We always have to keep that in mind. It is very easy sometimes to get caught up with adjuvants that it's just a spreading and wetting situation. That's just one part of it. With most cases, we're going to need to increase the degree and speed of absorption as well. So keeping evaporation at a minimum is a big issue. Next slide, please. And one of the dilemmas that we have, and it's sort of the irony, say that we get our spray deposit more thoroughly covered, more uniform, spreading is where we need to be. We have this negative backlash from that in the sense that you've increased the surface area of that droplet, then now you've made its ability to evaporate that much greater. So it's, I use the analogy of whack-a-mole. We fix one problem, the spreading issue, we create another with the evaporation issue. Next slide, please. So the way that historically we mitigate this, so the way we've had our cake and eat it too. In other words, to have our spreading and wetting at the same time, not losing our ability to enhance absorption, is to formulate surfactants with oils. And we essentially have three big groups. We can use a petroleum oil, which is where the big family of crop oil concentrates come from. Typically, the oil we use are paraffinic. We can use crop seed oils, and these are the straight seed oils like soybean and cottonseed and rapeseed oil. And then the category that is probably seeing the biggest growth and enhanced use of the herbicide category are the modified seed oils, or what we call methylated seed oils specifically. Next slide, please. And this has been our challenge over the years. I mean, historically, we've had this either or, with the surfactants, we can improve our wetting and spreading and reduce our spray bounce, get our coverage better. But then the downside is we get more foam, we tend to get more evaporation, and we get less driftable fines, or more driftable fines, excuse me. With oil concentrates, we increase our absorption, reduce evaporation, we have less foam, but typically their coverage and wetting is not as good, and there's more spray bounce with them. So we've always had this sort of either or, and having to balance the two out. Next slide, please. One of the things that we need to stress and recognize that there are some use rate generalizations that apply depending on whether or not you're using a surfactant or an oil. Typically, the surfactants are used at 6 to 2 quarts per 100 gallons of water, anywhere from 0.05 to 0.5% by volume. Typically, the lower rates are used when the volume spray volume is higher. But the thing to keep in mind is that our goal is to treat the water and not the acre. With the oils, it's another scenario. Typically the use rates are 2 to 4 quarts per 100 gallons of water, or 1 pint per acre, sometimes as high as 2 pints per acre. Aerial rates are 1 to 6 ounces per acre, but realize that they impact both the water and the plant surface. So with the oils, we're getting into more of a dose relationship and not just one of treating the water. Next slide, please. Uh, there are consequences. For example, if we don't recognize this, and this is something they've pointed out in academia, if we use our oils on a per volume basis, that's fine. But if we get below a certain amount, we can get a performance issue. Typically, we use 1 to 2 pints per acre of an MSO COC, and these were developed back when spray application volumes ranged from 25 to 50 GPA. As the GPA fell from 10 to 15, these spray volumes by volume uses fell between 1 and 2.5%. So that became an alternative rather than a flat pint per acre, for example. But if we get below 10 gallons per acre, now we start getting into a situation where the percent by volume that's being used at 1% is not delivering enough oil. So be aware of that. We're trying, in many cases, the labels will dictate that you need to have 1 pint per acre of a particular oil. Make sure your spray volumes account for that. Next slide, please. One of the more relatively recent categories of adjuvant that's been introduced are the high surfactant oil concentrates, or HSOCs. These materials essentially came out of the adjuvant industry. They were not developed like historically adjuvants were out of the surfactant companies. And what they are is a concept where you combine the properties of functional properties of both an oil with a surfactant. The ASTM definition is they contain between 25 to 50% of the surfactant mixed in with oil, and they have the functionality of both a oil concentrate and an NIS. You'll find that either MSO or paraffin oil is being used. And what makes them attractive to growers and applicators is they tend to simplify adjuvant decision making. And overall, they tend to have a bit better compatibility as well. Next slide, please. With soil applied herbicides, we also run into application variables with them as well. They can run off, they can volatilize, they're subject to volatile decomposition, they're subject to leaching and deep percolation issues. And adjuvants may be used to reduce the impact of some of these variables. Next slide, please. So the general guidelines for using them, and realize that this is a late developing field in terms of adjuvants and herbicides. There's more work being done. It's interesting, but you'll find that in most of the cases, the specific herbicide labels lack clear direction. So here's some generalizations you can follow. For best spray mix compatibility and lowest potential for tie-up in the soil, use adjuvants that are based on non-ionic surfactants. And you'll find that the use rates can vary dramatically depending on surfactant type, concentration, and application volume. When your goal is to essentially improve the wetting and penetration of water repellent soils, typical use rates range from 0.05 to 0.25%. But when you're impacting or trying to impact soil retention, you have to match the herbicide with its oil solubility and the adjuvant being used. And so this one can be a lot more challenging. Use rates typically range from 1 to 2%, but they can range quite more than that depending on the soil organic matter. So with using adjuvants for the purposes of soil retention is something that you're going to have to rely a lot on for your adjuvant supplier to give you some guidelines on. Next slide, please. So on the subject of spray adjuvants and crop safety, uh, used alone, the adjuvants and particularly when used at label rates have very low potential for crop injury. The materials in them are not known to be necessarily injurious to plant tissue, but issues do occur and can occur if you have multiple components in a mix, low application volumes, high conditions of heat and humidity, and importantly, if your spray mix is not uniform and is separated. And unfortunately, in many cases, adjuvants may actually reduce crop injury potential by correcting this separation issue in particular, keeping materials on target, reducing some of the spray droplet bounce that often occurs when you're applying pesticide or herbicides and they bounce to areas they're not supposed to and can cause damage. And you'll also find label and tech bulletins, along with commercial experience and training, are great ways to minimize this potential. So there's an old saying about how a fool only tests the depth of the river with both feet. So this is something if you have a spray mix that you do not have any kind of a history with or familiarity with, then this is an area that you should go slow and get that experience before you try it. Next slide, please. So general guidelines, again, always stress the labels and technical bulletins as well. If you do have a multiple pesticide mix, follow the recommendations of the most restrictive product that is in that mix, and be aware that humidity and high temperatures and low spray volumes tend to increase that potential. Another thing, if you've got a mix that you've never looked at before, and particularly a mix that has a fertilizer in it, we stress that always do a jar test. Make sure that this mix is fully uniform and dispersed. Uh, Improperly dispersed or mixed mixes can be a big source for crop injury. Another thing to be aware of, and you'll find this warning on numerous herbicide labels, UN 28 and 32, urea ammonium nitrate solutions can be excellent potentiorators. However, they tend to have this ability to increase injury potential, particularly if you have oils and other materials mixed with them. So again, your label is your guide with this particular one. Realize, I think we all do, that hotter, so to speak, comes with oil-based adjuvants compared to surfactants. But what a lot of people are not aware of, that some oils are essentially hotter than others. Next slide, please. If you look through the literature, you look through commercial experience, you can make a ranking like this, and let's say you're in a situation where you don't know if a particular mix is it's borderline safe. You've had issues in the past. Okay, as a general rule, if you've got an aromatic solvent or emulsifiable concentrate, those tend to be the hottest, followed by methylated seed oils, followed by paraphenols, and probably the least likely to cause any kind of a crop injury in combination with another herbicide are the seed oils, things like soybean, cottonseed oil, those type of materials. So this is a rule of thumb that has been quite consistent over the years. And also be aware, when you throw in conditions of high heat and humidity and low spray volumes, all of this goes up in terms of potential risk. Next slide, please. Adjuvants do have a role in herbicide resistance management. By depositing and maintaining actives on the intended target and maximizing efficacy to prevent escapes, they have a big role in minimizing this ever-growing problem. And so this gets back to the issue of improving compatibility. We've got more and more multiple spray components in a given mix. How do we make all these compatible? And again, stressing that uniformity and well-dispersed spray mix that we need. Next slide, please. So as a general rule, low spray volumes, higher agitation speeds, SC formulations, and joint applications, they're going to give you more compatibility and foaming problems. You can almost count on it. We stress that and highly recommend that if you have a liquid fertilizer component in with the herbicides, we also include a compatibility agent. And another safe bet is that with multiple spray mixes, you're going to get more foam. And we tend to use our foam control agents after the fact. They're much more effective when used as a preventative, added as a first component. And we always stress that they're being included to prevent problems. And it's more than just a nuisance. High levels of foam can impact your calibration. They can impact compatibility as well. Next slide, please. One of the reoccurring problems that I would run into on when I had a tech support role was this issue of hose and seals compatibility, particularly with methylated seed oil based adjuvants. And what we have learned and find, and sometimes these are lessons learned the hard way, that hoses and seal material made of rubber, butadiene, EPR, EDM, and EPDM may be subject to attack by methylated seed oil. And this applies to all methylated seed oil products, regardless of what their seed source from. And what we identified as the issue here is that with all these seals and hoses and so on, we have compatibility guidelines on what they should be used with and not with. And unfortunately, a lot of them lack any kind of discussion for methylated seed oil. So what we recommend that when you're checking compatibility of your hoses and seals with a particular solvent and you don't see MSO, look for any reference to methyl oleate or biodiesel. You'll tend to more likely find these components in your compatibility charts. And if they have a warning about methyl oleate or biodiesel as in terms of compatibility, that will apply to MSOs as well. And with that, next slide. Greg is going to pick up and talk about another variable that we have to deal with and fight with herbicides. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Greg.
Thanks, Johnny. Thanks for the great presentation and the great information. So I'm going to begin with this saying right in front of you: plants don't drink rocks. And it sounds kind of dumb, but if things turn into crystals on the leaf surface, they're just not going to get into the plant. You may be fortunate enough to get some rewetting or things like that, but oftentimes you don't. And we don't get the herbicide to actually get into the plant, and so we get reduced control. And Johnny talked about a lot of the factors of evaporation and stuff like that. And certainly we can add things like the oils, or we can add humectants, or there may be humectants that are already in our adjuvants that we're using to help prevent the evaporation. And certainly we want to use the deposition and drift reduction adjuvants. They'll help us get more stuff there and get it in the plant. But over and above that story, we'd like to talk about the next slide, please, which is the quality of the water can have an effect on creating these crystals or these rocks that don't get into the plant. And we see it oftentimes with very hard water. Over 25 years ago, I was at North Dakota State University, where they were doing a lot of work with antagonism from cations in hard water, very poor quality water. And we have these impurities such as calcium, magnesium. We might see some zinc or iron or manganese in these water sources. And they can actually combine and become crystals and not get in the plant. And we see this often with glyphosate, with Liberty, one of the first things we noticed it with was actually some group 1 herbicides, the grass control herbicides, where they would be deactivated by these cations. And it is a factor that we need to be aware of. And water quality varies in different places, different water sources, and it is something we need to be aware of. Having said that, one of the things we can do is to add ammonium sulfate to help improve the water quality of that water source. I'm going to start before I go into that, because this happened before we were actually commonly using AMS to condition water. And one of the things that they found out back then, glyphosate was used by itself. And they were able to improve the performance of glyphosate by getting rid of some of the water in that application. So instead of spraying at 20 gallons per acre or 15 gallons per acre, they were actually spraying at 5 or 2.5 gallons per acre and improving the performance of the glyphosate because they were getting rid of a lot of the cations. There wasn't very much cation in there, where there was at 15 or 20 gallons, there wasn't at those low uses. Now that works really great for glyphosate, but it doesn't work for almost everything else we're using. And so we need to go to higher rates for the other herbicides and need to deal with water conditioning. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is a map of the United States and Canada, and it's different water qualities in different areas. And as we look at it, the blues are very soft water, very few cations in there. And then we get to the browns or the oranges. That's very hard water. The pinks are almost as hard. And so we're going to see issues where, especially where we've got these very hard quality waters. Having said that, not all the waters are the same. In most situations, what we're going to see is that the city waters are often conditioned, so the city water generally isn't too bad. Some of the rural water systems have pretty good water, and then the wells are all over the place. We have very good quality wells. We have very poor quality wells. And so knowing what your water source is in fact important. One of the things I would say is that we definitely need a water conditioner. Another thing I would say is that as we're looking at AMS for a water conditioner, one of my cautions to you is use plenty of AMS, because we have found in a lot of testing that even with distilled water, which doesn't need any conditioning, we get better weed control with additional AMS, even with those distilled waters. So we want you to use the AMS to get the result, you're looking for. Another thing we have with these very soft waters, you may not need to do much water conditioning, but generally you're going to have a lot more foam in those areas. When you've got very soft water, you're going to have more foam. And so let's go to the next slide. Okay, here we've got some molecules there, and these are in fact 2 glyphosate molecules. We'll pretend that this is in a tank of spray water. Okay, next slide. And we've just added calcium to the water source. And then when we add that calcium to that, there's a reaction, and that's pretty much an irreversible reaction. We have tied up 2 glyphosate molecules with that 1 calcium, and that's going to be a crystal or a rock. It's not going to get into the plant. It's not going to control the weeds that you're looking for. And so we want to prevent that from happening. And so we will try to condition the water to make sure that that doesn't happen. Next slide, please. So this is a wheat leaf under an electron microscope, and they've taken a picture of glyphosate with surfactant in a spray solution and took a picture of it. This was done at by Dr. John Nalawaya at NDSU. What we've got here, as I said, is glyphosate and non-active surfactant. Do you see any crystals? No, you really don't. And that's great because this glyphosate will get into that plant and it will control the plant as we're looking for it to do. So we don't want crystals. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, all we did on this slide is we added some calcium to that glyphosate and that non-ionic surfactant. Do you see crystals? Yes, you do see crystals, and these are bad because these are calcium glyphosate crystals. They are not going to be able to get in the plant. They're not going to work. This is where we get our antagonism. Okay, next slide. Now we took that mixture and we added ammonium sulfate to it. Do you see crystals? Yes, you do. Now those crystals, we're not going to worry about it because they are calcium sulfate crystals. The sulfate from the AMS combined with the calcium to make calcium sulfate, which is gypsum. It wants to be a rock, and it is a rock on that on that leaf surface, and we don't care. The nice thing is we've got ammonium that can combine with the glyphosate, and that will stay liquid for a lot longer than other molecules. It'll stay liquid a lot longer and have a chance to get in the plant. And then because of the advantages of ammonium, that ammonium will actually help that glyphosate get into that plant. So we are going to get better control. And so that's why AMS is such a good thing to use with glyphosate. And we get what we're looking for. We're talking about glyphosate here. The same thing is going on with glufosinate. It's going on with some of the other herbicides where this antagonism can take place, and the AMS can make things better. Next slide. Okay, next slide. So in the past at NDSU, they actually made standard curves with the different cations and came up with a formula for how much AMS you need to condition the water. And this formula works very, very good. But again, I would caution you here. You may get some really low amounts. It may not take a lot of AMS to actually condition the water, but I strongly recommend adding in additional AMS to, in fact, give you better weed control because we mentioned earlier on that you can get this benefit even with distilled water. So we want to keep that AMS rate high. Going back to when we talked about the water, what we want to do is if you're going from 10 gallons per acre GPA to 15 or 20, and you've got poor quality water, you're going to want to keep your AMS rate high in order to handle all of the extra cations. Because when you have a mixture of cations and water, and then you increase your rate by twice, you've just put twice as much cations in that water. So we want to make sure we have enough there. Okay, next slide. And there's one more. I mean one back. And there's there. So we talked about AMS, and AMS is a great adjuvant component, does wonderful things, but that's not the only way we can condition water. The next one we can do is with many things, especially the glyphosate and the Liberty. Next slide. We can acidify that spray solution. We can add some type of acid in there, bring the pH down, and that will actually condition the water, make certain herbicides work better. Now, the thing with that is they're going to cost more than AMS, and a lot of times people will use a lower rate, and a higher rate will generally perform better than a lower rate. And so that's something to be aware of. The other thing with this pH adjusting, the acidifying, um, it may work really great with the glyphosate or the Liberty, but some of the other products that you're working with or putting into tank mixes may not like that acidifier. For example, we've got the group 2 herbicides generally like higher pH water, and that acidifier may make them precipitate out. We've seen that with Sharpen. We've seen that with some of the HPPD herbicides where they don't like the acidifier. And so that's a thing to be aware of as you're making your tank mixtures. And then the next one, next slide, we have what are called sequestering agents. And what these are, they come from the water treatment industry. They're anti-scale agents, things like that. They want to tie up calcium so that it doesn't make lime and scale and things like that. And these actually do work pretty well in an adjuvant system to tie up the cations. But once again, these are quite expensive materials. And so a lot of times people like to use lower rates of them. And you may not be getting as much conditioning as you're looking for. A higher rate may work better, but it is going to be quite a bit more expensive. And so these are 3 different ways to condition the water. They all work, but the AMS is a good, solid adjuvant system because you get the water conditioning and you get some additional benefits from the AMS helping things get into the plant. And with that, I believe that I'm turning it back to Johnny.
So to sort of wrap things up in this, what does all this mean? And adjuvants clearly can be useful tools in addressing the variables that impact herbicide efficacy and application. As always, the labels are getting better about guides for their use, but if the label does not have any specific recommendation, let your adjuvant manufacturer be your guide on that, and as well as your training. And keeping more of the herbicide where it's intended should always be a goal, and adjuvants have a role in doing that. Some of the other guidelines to follow, if you're being had situations where performance has been inconsistent in the past, particularly with some of your soil applied herbicides, or you've encountered spray application mixing problems, adjuvants could be a good tool to resolve both of those. And then keeping in mind those adjuvants that do prevent application problems. Always include a foam control adjuvant in with your mixes. If there is a liquid fertilizer in the mix, we strongly recommend a compatibility agent to just prevent those problems from occurring. Next slide. So what are, we always poll our members about, what are your customer objections to using adjuvants with herbicides? I mean, after all, it's another cost in a market with declining commodity prices. And some of the objections we'll hear is that, well, if they really needed it, the adjuvant will be built into the product. And that's true. There are a lot of herbicide products with adjuvant systems built into them. Glyphosate, glyphosate, clethodims. But the problem you run into, the limitation, is that there's so many variables in a spray mix. Growers will change the application volume. A lot of these materials have very low use rates, and so that delivers insufficient amounts of the adjuvant. So we have real limitations to being able to do that. And you'll also hear that, well, I've never had performance issues before. We're farming outdoors. The conditions vary, ag input formulations vary and are subject to change. So that doesn't mean that you're not going to have a performance issue based on what you've experienced in the past. And how do you know if you even need them? Again, keeping these pesticides where they're intended to be should always be a goal of any application. And in terms of their costs, we could argue that maximizing efficacy is likely cheaper than a respray or the time lost in correcting application problems. Okay. And Hunter, I believe I'll turn it back to you now.
Yeah, so with that, we want to open it up for questions in just a second. But I did want to thank you again for attending today's webinar and wanted to thank our webinar sponsors, Drexel Chemical Company and Helena Agri Enterprises, for their generous sponsorship. So we certainly appreciate them. And as I go through the next couple of slides, I want to again remind you that you can take out your mobile device and scan the QR code on the screen to obtain your one IPM CEU credit. Want to thank the Certified Crop Advisor Program for sponsoring that and for allowing us to be certified for that. So as I move into the chat function, I will start with the questions at the top. What percentage of complaints come from the lack of proper adjuvant to make water more like an oil that plants prefer?
It's difficult to give you a percentage. You know, we know that in the old days, in the late 70s and early 80s, we used high volumes of water to overcome a lot of these problems. And today we use much lower spray volumes. So I would dare say that a lot of our applications are not getting where they need to be. A lot of materials winding up in uh, everywhere else but on the intended target. But don't know the exact percentage, but I'd be willing to say it's quite common.
Yeah, and then I would actually add this to that is that um, in my experience we have a lot more problems when it's colder. So early in the spring, when we've got cold water, the chemicals are cold, the plants are cold, things like that. We have a lot more problems with mixing, and we have a lot more problems with poor weed control at that time. As things warm up, it gets better.
Next question, with regards to the use of adjuvants on soil applied herbicides, is there a typical rule of thumb on overall improvement in weed control due to better soil penetration?
You'll find there are some replicated studies out there that do document that. The big challenge you have with these soil applied herbicides is that there's such a variability in soil type. For example, if you have lots of high organic matter or OM above 4%, oftentimes that will act as a better retainer of the herbicide than any adjuvant you would use. But if that organic matter falls below that, then the impact of the adjuvant can be quite dramatic. So this is an area that I would fall back with the supplier of the particular adjuvant. You know, what has been your history? What kind of improvements can I expect with my particular organic matter? But it's again hard to find a specific improvement number that you could give it across the board.
Yeah, I agree that the one thing that I feel very comfortable with is that when you're using the deposition and drift reduction adjuvants, you are getting more herbicide where you want it to be. And then it gets a little bit more complicated after there because the soils are different, the environments are different. Did it rain? Did it not rain? All of those things. So it makes it really hard to predict.
Regarding the ESA approved labels, label rules are based on volume of DRA in the tank, not efficacy. Is that correct? And 2.5% of total tank volume is a lot. Will most of this be oil, MSO, or crop oil?
First, that is that is an error in terms of the volume use of that particular recommendation. So you'll see that be adjusted to more traditional use, probably from a half to 1%. But it will be driven by data that the particular DRA will have to demonstrate its ability to reduce driftable fines within a certain tolerance before that buffer is reduced. But we do see that expanding on the types. That's something that CPDA is working aggressively with the EPA on. We expect to see that open up to include the polymers as well once we provide enough data to the agency. And again, hats off to CPDA and its members and all there's been about 30 different companies to supply data to get this expanded. So yes, that is an era. It will be lower than a 2% recommendation. And we see it expanding to other DRAs in the near future.
Does an oil-based DRA also provide some level of humectancy?
Yes. Yes, it does. That's why traditionally they were used so extensively in aerial applications where the volumes of water were so low. Uh, Oils have had a long history of mitigating that effect, and they were the best way to overcome the whack-a-mole problem of spreading the
Right.
water out too much.
Yep.
Did Dr. Nalwaja report the time of mixing of ammonium sulfate and glyphosate and hard water is not important? That would mean the calcium reacting with glyphosate is not irreversible.
So there's several things in that. Um, the first one is it is very, very hard to get those to break apart when they actually form. And then there's been questions about that. So I'm just going to say this, that I believe that most of the antagonism actually takes place on the leaf surface when that droplet is drying. That calcium and that sulfate are going to form there, and you won't be able to bring it back. And the ammonia and the glyphosate actually get in the plant. Most of the antagonism is going to be at that leaf surface. However, um, not all of it happens there. When you look at your spray tank and there's that grit inside there, that's actually the same thing too. So there's a lot of studies that say that it doesn't matter when you put the AMS in, because it's happening at the leaf surface. I believe putting it in as early as possible is the best, because you can get some things happening in that spray tank, especially if you have to drive a long way to the field and you've got a load mixed up. The longer they're together, the more chance there is for that calcium and that glyphosate to mess each other up.
Yeah, I agree. And just overall, better compatibility. Just some of these water conditioners can be acidic, and having those fully diluted in the water before you add other components just lessens the chance of a problem. If you add the water conditioner after the uh, pesticide, you could run the risk of them coming into contact before the water conditioner is diluted. So it's just a good overall practice to put them in first.
Could amphoteric molecules work as water conditioners?
Hmm.
I would say perhaps. So they they um they can condition because what you're doing is you got different charges on there in different places, so you may be able to get some separations and things like that. So you can get some conditioning. The one thing that I'd see there is you're not getting the ammonia to help out, and and then it would be each product is how good is it? What is that molecule, and how much of it is there?
As a manufacturer, should we discourage developing soluble concentrates as there can be performance issues due to adjuvants, especially oils? And if yes, instead of SCs, MFRs, manufacturers should develop what type of formulations for insecticides, herbicides, fungicides?
Well, in a perfect world, I would say turn everything into an EC.
Yeah, yeah,
But it's not a perfect world. We can't use ECs. So
yeah.
for everything.
So,
Um,
so, yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, go ahead. I mean, I think we're always going to have this challenge. It's going to be hard to like focus everything on one formulation type to avoid the problems.
And
These are tools to mitigate them. Is how we'll
and
use them.
And I agree. In an ideal world, things would be soluble in water. Almost none of our herbicides are soluble in water. They'll turn them into salts to make them behave in water a little bit. The flip side is things can be soluble in oil, and as Johnny just mentioned, that's a great thing because things behave pretty good in that oil state. And then there are things that don't really, they're not soluble in water and they're not soluble in oil, and they end up being these suspended solids, and they're used that way. And then you've got other factors in there. The SCs are probably cheaper to make than some of the ECs, and ECs can have all kinds of volatility issues and toxicity issues. So you're not going to get away from the SCs, but we need to make sure everything behaves itself.
Well, thank you. That's about all the time we have for today. I want to thank everyone for your attendance. And do note on this slide, the date is incorrect. It'll be February 11th for our next webinar, Storage and Handling of Pesticides, sponsored by Brandt. So appreciate their sponsorship as well. I will leave the QR code up for just a little bit for folks who haven't had time to scan it. But once again, I want to thank Johnny Roberts and Greg Dahl for your great presentations. Want to thank our partnership with CPDA and then also Drexel Chemical Company and Helena Agri Enterprises for sponsoring today's webinar. Additional thanks to all of you who attended and participated today despite your busy schedule. So thanks, everyone. Hope you have a great week.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank everyone for your attention.